Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hello, I am your host, Dr. Kevin Gluck, a senior research scientist at IHMC, stepping in to help with today's episode of STEM Talk. Joining me is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the Double Secret Selection Committee that selects all of the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hello, Kevin. Great to be here.
Today we have with us Dr. Hans van Dongen, director of the Sleep and Performance Research Center at Washington State University in Spokane. Hans is known for his studies on inter-individual differences in vulnerability to fatigue, as well as cumulative cognitive deficits following chronic sleep restriction. He also is known for his mathematical modeling of fatigue's effects on performance. At the Sleep and Performance Research Center, Hans and his colleagues also investigate how sleep loss and circadian misalignment impact human brain function, cognition, and behavior.
But before we get to our interview with Hans, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews.
As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by Joe Brown 8146. It reads, "Thank you. I enjoyed listening to the Dave Feldman interview as a metabolically healthy, non-lean mass hyperresponder with a recent calcium score of 0, who has been a low carber for 2 years and 8 months. I am very interested in the results of these studies."
Thank you, Joe Brown 8146, and thanks to all of our other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Okay, now on to today's interview with Dr. Hans van Dongen.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hello, welcome to STEM Talk. This is Ken Ford, and joining us today is Hans van Dongen. Hans, welcome to STEM Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining me today is Kevin Gluck.
Hello, Ken, and hello, Hans. It's great to have you with us today. Now, Hans, you're from the Netherlands, and growing up, I understand your family moved around quite a bit.
They did. Yeah, both my parents had jobs in various different fields and areas, and so we moved around, and I got exposure to different parts of the country. Now, the Netherlands is rather small, so don't get any wrong expectations here. But moving around got me exposed to sort of different parts of the country, and also with my parents having these different jobs, getting a sense that anything that you put yourself to, you can actually accomplish. That's sort of what I grew up with that idea. But it involves moving. So.
That sounds interesting. So I'm curious, what kind of child would you characterize yourself as?
I think I would have to go back to what my mom would probably say, is that I was that kid that would always ask why and then would argue if I didn't like the answer. And I was a good student in high school, but I think my parents would probably say that I was difficult to raise.
As would most.
Yeah.
As would most. Your father was a teacher who taught subjects like physics, math, and chemistry. Tell us about the role he played in developing your interest in science.
Yeah, he was a gifted teacher. He has this gene that I don't have about really making every possible topic explainable. And so he taught all the life sciences and some biology and medicine as well. And I learned a lot from that. What was particularly cool is he was at some point in his career at a hands-on museum, and he would take me there on the weekends, and they had the first home computer in the Netherlands. I actually had a token ring of what were Commodore PETs, very early computer type, and I got to play with that. And I think it was awesome because it was letting a curious kid loose in basically the toy store for computer stuff at the time. And so there was this token ring, and you would have to wait for hours until your program actually came off the cassette tape. But it gave me the chance to get exposure to computers early on, and it really sort of set the stage for the rest of my career.
Such important developmental experiences. That's great. After high school, you went to Leiden University, which will soon celebrate its 450th anniversary. You graduated with a degree in astrophysics. Can you give us some background on how you ended up specifically interested in astrophysics?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I had all this exposure to the different life sciences and I wasn't really quite sure which one I would want to study, I ended up studying astrophysics because in astrophysics, you get exposure to all these things. You get a lot of math, you get a lot of physics, you get some chemistry, a little bit of biology, which just astrobiology was just starting at the time. And so I just basically picked a field where I would get exposure to all of these things and absorb all of it. Not really thinking that I was going to be an astrophysicist necessarily later in life. And when you sign up for astrophysics, they tell you that you're not going to be an astrophysicist. Very unlikely that you will. But you will be able to do pretty much anything else you put yourself to because you have learned all these different skills. And that's exactly what happened. I learned a ton of all these different parts of science and then could apply that anywhere I wanted.
That makes perfect sense. And that has been the experience of several of my friends who have degrees in astrophysics, even PhDs in astrophysics. Most of them apply that knowledge to other fields. As you were wrapping up that degree in astrophysics, you had the good fortune to work in a psychophysiology lab. Can you share how this experience put you on a path to specialize in sleep research?
So the reason I ended up at that lab was that my astrophysics studies were taking a little longer than my parents originally thought was necessary. And so I needed to get a job to get some money to get me through the rest of my master's at the time. And I joined the psychophysiology lab as a computer programmer. And at the time, they had just invented these devices that could measure with rest activity patterns your sleep-wake schedules. We call them Fitbits now or Apple Watches or what have you. But at the time, they were actigraphs that had just been invented, and they were hardware, they were big, and they had no software with it. You just got data. And so my job at that lab was to write a computer program or software that would take those data, process them, and analyze people's sleep-wake schedules where they're collected this way. And then later, about a year later or so, that same lab started building a sleep lab. It had been focused on the biological clock originally, but it started to get interested in sleep, and it built a sleep lab. And so I got the opportunity to wire that sleep lab because with astrophysics, I had all these skills that I could use. I knew a lot about electronics and computers and digital sampling and what have you. And so I got a chance to wire this lab, and I got exposure to that equipment that people use to record sleep and record the brain. And I thought it was mighty interesting. It was so cool to be able to do that. And so I sort of, through a side door, if you will, got involved in all this, what was then a new field of sleep research, got exposure from the ground up on the technical side initially. But then it turns out that as a science itself, the sleep science is also very interesting. So the topic is very interesting. And by being exposed to it from the technical side, I got exposed to it also from the scientific side. And so that's how I rolled into it.
So you continued this research as you worked toward a PhD, where you were part of a study that proved that the morning-evening chronotype was a biological trait and not a psychological trait. At the time, this was a very new finding, wasn't it? Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, at the time, people thought, based on popular sayings like the early bird gets the worm and that kind of stuff, that morningness or people that like to get up early in the morning and are active early in the day are the industrious types, the people that get lots of stuff done and are conscientious and all those sorts of things. And the evening types are really the party types and the lazy types. And so these were thought to be personality traits. I had the privilege to work in this lab where the supervisor that I work with, Professor Gerard Kerkhoff, he believed that maybe it wasn't quite that simple and maybe there was some biology to this. Maybe the biological clock, which had only just been discovered to be a part of the brain, might play a role, and maybe in morning type individuals that biological clock runs a little bit earlier and in evening type people that runs a little bit later. And the difference between morning and eveningness or between early birds and late owls is all about the biological clock and how it runs. And so my job as a PhD student was to actually run an experiment to demonstrate that whether or not that was true. And sure enough, we did demonstrate that. We found that that's exactly what's happening and published it. And since then, it's now taken for granted. But since then, we now understand that being a morning or an evening type person is a biological trait and not a psychological trait per se.
Really interesting. And I remember those days when it was like the early bird gets the worm. And yeah, I would have a whole jar full of worms. I'm super early bird. And I don't think I have any choice about it.
That's right. You don't have a choice about it. It's biologically determined.
and I've known a few of those outlier people who are all day and all night people. And
I think they just have a clever way of making it seem that way.
So, what then led you to cross the Atlantic and take a postdoc position at the University of Pennsylvania?
Well, so I didn't really have a plan what would come after my PhD. I mean, I obviously got interested in sleep research and the circadian or the biological clock stuff was really interesting and publishing was exciting, but I didn't really have a plan for what would come after that. And we're now talking in the early days where email had just been invented, and it's unbelievable to say that now, but that was a new thing. And listservs had come about, and so there were these blasts of emails that people would send. And across from the US, we got these emails from time to time where they were advertising for positions for people looking for a job to do something in science. And I signed up for the listserv for sleep and circadian research, and got one of those listserv emails came from the University of Pennsylvania, where David Dinges had a lab that was interested in sleep deprivation. And so I got this email. Long story short, I basically said, I would love to come work for you, but I haven't graduated yet. And then after a while, I found that this position was still open. When I finally graduated, I went over there and started doing research on sleep deprivation. And David Dinges at the time was up and coming. He wasn't all that well known yet, but a few years after that, very quickly after that, he became a world star in his field. And I was very privileged to be at that lab and sort of be pulled with the wake of his successes and build my own career there. It was awesome.
And that was where we first met, when you were at Dinges' lab, Hans. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Your next big journey took you from the eastern U.S. to the northwestern U.S. and Washington State University in Spokane, Washington. This came about as a result of an invitation from Greg Belenke. Could you talk about Greg a little bit and the substance of his invitation?
Yeah, so Greg Belenke was doing research a few years before that at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, where he was looking at the effects of chronic sleep restriction. At the same time that the lab that I was at the University of Pennsylvania was also looking at chronic sleep restriction. And so we knew each other from these sort of parallel lines of research where we were looking at the same question from different angles, but basically trying to get the same answers out of nature. And he retired as a colonel at Walter Reed and had lots of years of fruitful career ahead of him, and moved over to Washington State University, where he got recruited to build a new sleep lab in Spokane, at the Spokane campus, where there was money that had been deposited there to actually build this program. So he went to Spokane, which was a relatively new campus for the university. It was quite small. He looked around and he was like, there is not enough people here to actually get me get this mounted. So he decided he needed to make some calls and get some help. And so he called me up just at about the time that I had just graduated, moved to, promoted to associate professor, and had started to think about, I need to start thinking about what comes after, because my career was going quite well. And David Dinges' career was even better. And I realized that the lab that I was at was going to be too small at some point. And so the thought had taken root that I needed to start thinking about what the future might bring. And then I get this call from Greg Belenke. He says, well, I'm here now in Spokane, and we have resources to build a new sleep lab, and I'm looking for somebody to help me. And since we worked on the same issues, I think it would be cool if you would come over. And so it was, proverbially speaking, it was a short conversation. It was like, this is an awesome opportunity. And a year later, I went to Spokane as well, and I'm still there.
Really interesting how our lives are shaped by things like a phone call that you didn't expect.
Yeah.
And you grab the opportunity or not, and it makes a big difference in the trajectory of one's life.
Yes, absolutely.
The Sleep and Performance Research Center, where you are now the director, is a coalition of basic and applied research laboratories that aim to understand the neurobiology of sleep and sleep loss. You and your colleagues particularly investigate sleep and biological rhythms and their impact on health and performance. Could you give our listeners an overview of what sleep loss is and the effect that sleep loss has on our metabolism and immune system, as well as on our cognitive performance?
Yeah, it's an interesting question in part because the more I know about sleep loss, the more I realize that we don't really know all that much yet. So sleep loss is not actually very well defined or precisely defined. And that's because we don't really know precisely what sleep need is to begin with, or how much sleep need somebody would have. But for practical purposes, we can use like 7 or 8 hours a day as a benchmark. And if you get 7 or 8 hours a day of sleep, then you will maintain a stable level of performance over time for most people. And so sleep loss is sort of indirectly defined as if you don't get that kind of sleep, that where you can maintain a stable level of performance. And so it's an indirect definition. But what the consequences of sleep loss then are is that if you don't sleep enough, you will suffer consequences in terms of cognitive performance. You will be less able to do a variety of things with your brain. in terms of cognitive performance, which I'm sure we'll talk about some more about that in a bit. But also, we have now come to the conclusion that it's not just brain functioning that's changing, but it's also what happens to your body. And so we know there's dysregulation of all kinds of organs and tissues and systems in biology in very complex ways that we surprisingly don't really fully understand yet. For instance, if I do an acute sleep deprivation where I just let you have an all-nighter, and so you're not sleeping at all, then we see changes in the immune system, which make us think that your immune system is now compromised. But if I do chronic sleep restriction, so I'm not giving you enough sleep, I'm giving you some sleep, but not enough sleep day after day after day, we also see changes in the immune system, but they're in the opposite direction. And so now we know there's dysregulation, things go wrong in the body somehow. But precisely what that means and what the consequences of that are and how that unfolds is actually somewhat mysterious still. And we don't really fully understand that. So we know it's probably not a good thing to be sleep deprived and have sleep loss, but precisely why and how that unfolds is yet to be discovered.
It's interesting you're speaking to some longer-term effects associated with sleep loss, despite the fact that in the general public, we often think of the consequences of a poor night's sleep as immediate, right? It's the way you feel the next day. Let's dig into that just a little bit more. So you recently published a paper that investigated how circadian misalignment due to night shift work has been associated with an elevated risk of chronic diseases. This paper attracted a great deal of attention because it showed that just a few days on a night shift schedule throws off protein rhythms related to blood glucose regulation, energy metabolism, and inflammation. It explained why night shift workers are more prone to diabetes, obesity, and other metabolic disorders. Can you talk about this study and how you found that these effects can be seen in as little as 3 days?
Yeah, with my colleague Shoban Garamidi, who really helped me design this study, we went after this question about what is it that causes shift workers, people who work at night, to have these long-term health consequences where they, over time, develop increased risk of cancer, but also metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, a variety of other things that make it seem that shift work is ultimately not a very healthy thing to do. And we were asking ourselves, can we actually see the consequences of shift work sort of unfolding in real time? And so we developed this experiment where in the sleep lab in Spokane, people were on a simulated day shift schedule or on a simulated night shift schedule for 3 days in a row. And then after those 3 days, we put them under a constant routine protocol. And a constant routine protocol means that you keep the circumstances in the lab exactly the same for 24 hours. Lights is the same, the temperature is the same, food is spread out over the 24 hours in small 1-hour snacks that you distribute over the day. So the food intake is all spread out. They're being kept awake, so there's no sleep. They're being in the same position, semi-recumbent, so there's no positional movements or activity or anything like that. And under those circumstances that we call the constant routine protocol, if you then take measurements across the 24 hours, you get a very precise reading of what the biological clock is doing to your body. And so it's the way to unmask the activity of the biological clock in the absence of anything else. And so in this particular study design, in that constant routine protocol, during those 24 hours of constant routine, we got a readout of what the 3 days of shift work that happened before that, either day shift or night shift, actually had done to the body. And so we took blood samples during those 24 hours of constant routine, and we analyzed those data for all kinds of molecules that you can now easily analyze. So metabolites, proteins, lipids, cytokines, hormones, you name it. We looked at everything. And time again, we saw that after 3 days on night work, the rhythms of these molecules that we looked at were significantly disrupted and oftentimes reversed compared to what we saw after 3 days on day shift. Meaning that within 3 days' time, we had an almost complete reversal and disruption of almost every molecule we ever looked at that's circulating in your blood, including a whole host of proteins that it later on turns out with further analysis to be related to glucose metabolism and insulin. And then we decided to do the most obvious thing what we should have done right from the get-go but never thought of. Let's look at actual glucose and actual insulin. And it turns out the glucose rhythm is also completely reversed. And so now remember, we're measuring this under these constant conditions where we're not inducing this rhythm. That's what the body is producing all by itself. So just 3 days on night work causes a complete reversal of glucose rhythm for reasons that we are yet to be completely uncovered. But it basically means that everything in the body is flipped such that your glucose rhythms are completely reversed. And then insulin, which is actually not supposed to be rhythmic under normal circumstances, and we don't see that in the day shift condition, now all of a sudden adopts a rhythm in the night shift condition, probably to undo the effects that were happening for glucose, right? Now, that is probably a healthy response to actually keep your body in homeostasis. But imagine that you're exposed to that kind of a schedule from day after day, month after month, year after year. And every time when you go on night shift, you experience this complete reversal of almost anything happens in your body. We imagine and we think that there's a wear and tear associated with that ultimately causes you to develop chronic disease. And that metabolic disorders that we see in night workers are probably starting to occur with those reversals of all these rhythms in glucose and insulin metabolism.
Did you also look at cortisol?
Yeah, so that's a very good question because cortisol is a good marker of the biological clock, just like melatonin. And that does not flip at all. That stays very stable. We've known this for a long time. The biological clock is very slow to adapt. And so your brain is basically saying day is day and night is night. And the periphery, the rest of your body is saying, no, night's day and day is night. And it's the discrepancy, the dysynchrony between the brain and the periphery that ultimately causes these long-term consequences because that's something you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to put a lot of resources into sort of cleaning that up, if you will. And then when you go back from your night shift to a day schedule and then back to a night shift schedule again and do this over and over and over again, we think there's a lot of wear and tear on the system that ultimately causes chronic disease.
Makes sense. And if a person stops night shift work, how long does it take them to return to their normal circadian self?
Yeah, we don't know the answer to that question, actually. But I think if it takes less than 3 days to flip completely, I would imagine that at least on the short term, it will take 3 days or less to flip back. But over the long run, if you're a shift worker who's been exposed to shift work for a long time, we think there will be other adaptations happening in the brain and in the body that may actually change that answer. We don't really know. We're pursuing that right now in an experiment we're trying to run with seasoned shift workers. People have been doing it for a long time and see if we get the same answers or maybe this looks differently if you've been exposed to shift work for a long time.
I was just going to ask you that. So very, very nice answer. You got that question and the very next thing that was in my head.
I get 2 points for that.
Hans, you had a paper that focused on the continually operating neurobiological mechanisms of the homeostatic and circadian processes as they affect neurobehavioral performance. Before we get into the details of the paper, could you first give listeners an overview of the homeostatic process and its relationship with the circadian process?
Yeah, before I answer that question directly, let me talk a little bit more about the circadian system first. So this is the biological clock we're talking about. That's part of the hypothalamus in the brain, and it keeps time for the brain and for the body. And its primary role, at least we believe, and there's good reason to believe this, is that it, as humans being a diurnal species, the biological clock job is to keep us awake during the day and make us sleep at night. And that, for a human being, is a smart way to do business because at night we don't function as well normally because it's dark and we don't have the senses to operate well, whereas during the day we can be very productive and we're much safer that way. So the circadian clock is a proactive system that basically regulates our biology to be in tune with the light-dark cycle based on the human's role within the larger ecological system. Now, from time to time, you will have to deviate from that rigorous schedule because something else happens. Like, for instance, I'm just making this up, of course, but let's say you're being chased by a lion and deep into the night. So now you're up at night and that's the biological clock doesn't really like that, but you're going to have to deal with it. You're going to have to get back to that normal day and night schedule. And so there is a secondary biological system that its job is to actually get you back to normal, if you will, or back to balance or homeostasis. And so we call that the homeostatic process. And its job is to provide that flexibility that if you deviate from your normal schedule, it will get you right back to a normal schedule really quickly. And so it basically tracks how much wakefulness you've had and how much sleep you've had and tries to balance these two states appropriately. So the longer you've been awake, the more pressure for sleep you'll build up. That we call that homeostatic pressure for sleep. And then you'll reduce that pressure for sleep while you're sleeping. And that's how the system balances out.
So following up on that and some of your earlier comments, it is the case, and it certainly from what you've said seems to be the case, that the biobehavioral function and evolutionary advantage of the circadian process is well recognized and established. But the neurobiology of the homeostatic process and its effects on performance are poorly understood, if I understood you right. In a 2011 paper that we were just mentioning, your goal is to shed light on the underlying mechanisms of the homeostatic process to propose an actual explanation for why the buildup of homeostatic pressure from sleep loss leads to instability in vigilant attention. To do that, however, you first explored what is known as the time-on-task effect. So what is the significance of the time-on-task effect and its role in cognitive performance?
So the time on task effect, in its simplest version of it, is basically the longer you're on a task, the longer you're engaged in a particular task, the more difficult it becomes to do it right. There's a wear and tear or a cost to being engaged in a task for a prolonged period of time. But in the 1930s already, so almost 100 years ago, Arthur Bills at the University of Chicago recognized that the time on task effect is not a gradual decline in your ability to perform while you're on a task, but actually comes in the form of some sort of instability. He called it blocking at the time, but it basically suggests that as you are engaged in a task for longer, there will be times when all of a sudden you're not able to do the task very well. And so you've got this little hiccup, if you will, or this little pause in your ability to do the task. And these pauses, these gaps, these blocks become more frequent the longer you're engaged in the task, right? So you get an instability in the brain as an after effect of being engaged in a particular task. Now, this caught my attention because in sleep deprivation, which was really what I was studying at the time, we see the exact same phenomenon. If you're sleep deprived, you also get this instability in the brain, and you get these same gaps or blocks, or we call them lapses now, lapses of attention, that start to become more frequent the more you are sleep deprived. Now, moreover, if you're sleep deprived and you do a task for a prolonged period of time, so now you evoke the time on task effect. The time on task effect will actually emerge much faster when you're sleep deprived than when you are rested. So now we got three phenomena where these gaps, these blocks are happening. The time on task effect, the sleep deprivation effect, and the interaction of those two effects amplifying each other, making it worse. And so I was thinking, this cannot be coincidence. There must be a same underlying mechanism here. There must be something systematic about this, that the time on task effect is in a way, if you will, like a mini sleep deprivation experiment, and vice versa. And so the path we took that is to say, well, let's assume that there is in fact an underlying mechanism that's shared between these phenomena. What would it be?
And to follow up on this important question about what it would be, the thing that we're trying to explain is what's happening with these pauses and blocks and lapses, right? And there's many different levels at which we can offer explanation in science, but you have hypothesized that neuronal groups that are involved in performing a given task will, quote, fall asleep, right, as a homeostatic consequence of sustained use. This leads to an interruption in information processing and thus performance impairment. So what sort of evidence exists now? We have the hypotheses, we know the phenomena that we're interested in, right? What's the scientific evidence in support of this hypothesis?
So actually, I can't take claim for that hypothesis. It's actually Jim Kruger that first posted, and then he and Dave Rector did a really very clever experiment. But let me tell you first a little bit more about what's going on here. So this hypothesis is known as the local sleep hypothesis, and it basically assumes that if you have a group of neurons that are processing information in a use-dependent way, the more you use these neurons, the more likely it is that they will actually go offline to take a little break. It's as if they are, as I said before, if they're sleep deprived, and now they need to get some sleep to recuperate from that. And so we call this local sleep because just at the level of these neurons particularly, but not the rest of the brain, you use those neurons and then they go offline to recuperate, to get some sleep. So hence local sleep. But the clever experiment that Dave Rector designed was to have a rat that he studied looking at the whisker barrel. So the whiskers, if you twitch a whisker in a rat, there's a whisker barrel, which is a group of neurons that monitors the activity of their whisker. And you can easily identify it. It's very clearly visible in the cortex. So you can look at a rat's brain and you can see this barrel monitors this particular whisker. So it's a very easy experiment to do once you do all the hard work to actually get the setup. And so now we twitched these whiskers and showed that the more you twitch your whisker, the more likely it will be that the whisker barrel that's monitoring this whisker will stop functioning. Because its job is to monitor this whisker, and so it's being used. If you use it a lot by twitching the whisker a lot, at some point it will stop working. And it won't register the whisker anymore, as if it's not processing any information anymore. And he showed that the more you twitch these whiskers, the more this phenomenon will happen. So that's use dependence. And also, the more likely you drive the whisker into the sleep-like state, the more you'll see this sleep, but also the more likely it will then be subsequently awake in a similar fashion to this homeostatic process that we talked about earlier. So there is this balance regulation on these whisker barrels that, first of all, you can drive a whisker barrel into a sleep-like state, and then the way that is regulated is homeostatically, so that the amount of wakefulness and the amount of sleep in the local group of neurons is homeostatically regulated. So now that's cool because that provides us a way to explain a whole bunch of phenomena, like these gaps that we talked about in the time on task effect. In the whisker barrel, you can directly show that the time on task effect in monitoring a whisker is related to the functioning of this one neuronal group falling asleep. So that provides us with an explanation for these blocks that Arthur Bills had shown 100 years ago. Those are neuronal groups basically falling asleep while they're doing a task and therefore becoming unresponsive. And that provides these little hiccups in the task performance that you have because the neurons are just offline. They're not working for you. Subsequent experiments, you can then demonstrate, I'll cut this short because it's a long story, but the relationship with sleep deprivation, the homeostatic regulation we've already talked about, all of the ingredients of the phenomena we've just discussed are present in the behavior of these small neuronal groups falling asleep locally. So they provide us with an explanation of why we think we see instability in the brain when you're sleep deprived, because these neurons have been used a lot, they've been used for a long time, they become more likely to fall asleep on you, and all of a sudden then they won't process any information. And if they don't process any information, we experience that as you're not there, you're lapsing, you missed something, right? So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that follows from this as well. There's individual differences in how well people deal with sleep deprivation. And these individual differences can probably be related to how many neurons do you have available to do a particular task in the first place. If you have lots and lots of neurons that you can throw at a particular task, then if some of those neurons fall asleep on you, you won't really notice the difference because you got plenty of other ones left. But if you've got a very narrowly defined pathway, either because you don't use it a lot or because that's the way your brain just works, and that pathway gets blocked by local sleep, then that means you will fail to do the task at hand for a while. And so individual differences in vulnerability to sleep loss could well be related to how much capacity you have in a particular neuronal pathway and how vulnerable is that pathway to actually local sleep events blocking it. And if you don't have a lot of reserves in that pathway, you're going to be more vulnerable. You're going to see more deficits.
So while we are all well aware of how in today's constant go-go 24/7 society, there's an increasing pressure for people to seem to work at all hours, that quite often leads to chronic sleep restriction and even sometimes sleep deprivation, both of which, as you have noted, have negative impacts on performance and health. Can you talk about the range of negative impacts? So we hit on this a little, but you could reiterate the range of negative impacts sleep deprivation and even sleep restriction will have on a person.
It affects pretty much all aspects of cognition, and that's from very simple things like maintaining focus on a task to being able to maintain situational awareness, to be able to deploy a cognitively flexible response to changing circumstances. Being able to regulate one's emotions. So self-regulation is affected. Obviously, also things like mood and sleepiness that we experience that make it difficult to keep going. Those are the more like basic effects that we see on the brain, but that also affects everything else we do, like driving. There's risk in driving. There's risk in using safety-sensitive machinery. The risk of making errors in your work performance, and ultimately the risk of doing something that leads to an accident or even a catastrophe, as we've got some notable examples of that in the newspapers from time to time. It affects everything. And so what's tricky about that is, of course, is that because of this instability that we talked about earlier, it's not true that you are systematically unable to do anything when you're sleep deprived. And people know this. They get away with being sleep deprived pretty well from time to time because they can still function. And they can probably still drive home just fine most of the time. It's the one rare instance where you're crossing this intersection, you're missing the traffic light, and there's somebody else on the intersection, but all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. Right? So these things happen to be rare, and so we don't really notice them as much, but we're being exposed to risk all the time when we're sleep deprived, and it impacts everything.
Makes sense, really. And, in my own experience, as well as research, has shown that sleep deprivation is particularly problematic for decision-making involving uncertainty and unexpected events, unexpected change. And this has really important implications for understanding and managing sleep loss-induced cognitive impairment in people like first responders and disaster management, and clearly in military operations. Could you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, so as I said, the effects of sleep deprivation are pervasive. They affect everything. But one of the things that is particularly noticeable, in addition to this instability that we already talked about, is this apparent inability to respond to changing circumstances. And there's something about sleep deprivation that locks you into what you plan to do that you've oftentimes been trained for very well to do over and over and over again. But now all of a sudden the circumstances change and it's no longer appropriate to what you're trying to accomplish. And the brain has this difficulty in recognizing that something has changed and then subsequently responding to it. We've shown that fairly conclusively about maybe 10 years ago or so for the first time, where we really nailed down this phenomenon. But more recently, we've started to recognize that there's yet something else underlying this that's really causing this problem to begin with. And that is the inability to bind information to other information in memory. And what I'm specifically talking about is binding context information to information that you have otherwise in your brain already. So why this is problematic if you can't bind context information to other information in your brain already is that if you are engaged in a task and all of a sudden the circumstances change, and normally when you're well rested, you would see that what you're trying to pursue is no longer effective, or something has changed, or there's a light that comes on that never seen before, something telling you that something is different, right? That light, that signal, that information, that feedback information that something has changed needs to be bound in your brain to the circumstances at hand, the thing that you're trying to do. And making that connection in your brain actually tells you that, oh, wait a second, I just did this action, and now the consequences of that are not what I expected. But to be able to draw that conclusion, you need to bind these two pieces of information together, what you were trying to accomplish and what actually happened. If you have an inability to bind this information, then that information can no longer be as meaningful to you as it should otherwise be. And we can see this, in fact, by the measuring skin conductance responses, which allow us to gauge the salience of information. When people are sleep deprived, the salience of an piece of information that says what you're trying to do is actually not helpful is dampened, as if that information somehow isn't important to the brain anymore. And we believe the reason this happens is that it's not bound to the original purpose of the action that you did. And so you can't actually in your brain draw the conclusion that what you were trying to accomplish is actually not functioning the way it's supposed to. And therefore you can't recognize there's a problem and you can't remediate. Mm-hmm. And this gets you to become perseverative. This gets you to do over and over again what you're trying to accomplish without registering the fact that this is no longer effective. And so you get stuck in what you're doing. You're not able to cognitively respond to changing circumstances. And I don't think I have to explain to you all why that is problematic in fast-moving environments where lives are at stake if you can't respond to the changes in the environment.
Yes, it might be that the sleep-deprived person is essentially relying on automaticity, you know, and one could see how that would be a problem when their automaticity doesn't match a rapidly changing world.
Yeah, and we're going to see that same phenomenon play out in like automated driving, where until we get to the point where we got like level 5 automation, where everything is completely automated, as long as the driver needs to be involved. But so now you're not engaged in the driving task, and all of a sudden you're being called upon to put your hands on the wheel and actually take evasive action or whatever. That your brain's not going to be able to do that well when you're sleep deprived for the same reasons. You're not going to be able to process very quickly how this car that's supposed to drive itself is now under your control, under circumstances you don't fully comprehend. Things are changing rapidly, and you can't connect that information with what you were already thinking was happening. And you're going to fail.
The self-driving car example is one of the worst ones that I could conjure up, because you're dealing with a degree of autonomy. So you're not really the operator of the vehicle in any case. At best, you could perhaps, with technological advancements, maybe some of Matt Johnson's work, you could become a teammate. But as operator of the vehicle, with what Hans was just describing, you're in big trouble. If things change and you're highly sleep deprived, I can see that. And there's a newer whole class of drugs that are now approved for use in many settings, including the one I was thinking of. One example would be modafinil. And modafinil shows better performance. But have you looked at modafinil and tried to understand how diminished these people are, or are they relatively doing okay?
So we actually just literally 5 weeks ago or so, or maybe 6 weeks ago, we unblinded on a study that answers this question. And so these results are unpublished and new, and therefore should be taken with a grain of salt. But what we see is that we actually compared modafinil to caffeine, another stimulant that we are all familiar with, to placebo. And we found, of course, that both modafinil and caffeine improve performance in general. But the question we were asking is, does that improvement in performance, is that across the board? Is it everything? Or is it just specific to like vigilance? Where we have good reason to believe that caffeine would work well for vigilance because it actually impacts directly on the mechanisms that underlie this local sleep phenomenon we talked about earlier. Modafinil works on a different mechanism. It has a dopaminergic point of action, including some other things, and the dopaminergic axis is actually involved in this cognitive flexibility perseveration domain. It does a whole bunch of other stuff too, but so we had this idea that maybe modafinil would be particularly helpful for tasks that are cognitively flexible, that require cognitive flexibility, whereas caffeine might be more important for tasks that require sustained focus, so sustained attention. We found some of that. Of course, as it always goes with when you query nature, it's more complicated than we thought originally. But we found some evidence that there is some differentiation in how these drugs act on the brain in terms of the kinds of tasks that it affects most. But to add an additional twist to that, there are genes that people have, variations on genes that people have that are very common. Where we had, in our population, we had these different genes in relatively large abundance. And so we could make comparisons to people that had a particular version of the dopaminergic D2 receptor, for instance, or a particular version of the ADORA2A, that's the adenosine A2 receptor, which are part of these different pathways in the brain that we think are involved. And it turns out there's an interaction between how these drugs work and which particular genes you have that adds an additional layer of complexity yet. I don't think with this particular study, we're going to be able to completely reveal how all of this works, but it shows the importance of something that's been on my mind for quite some time, is that not all performance is all the same. You have to really differentiate the different types of performance, and I know you guys know this too, but the different kinds of performance to really be able to say something meaningful about how a person works, how a drug works, how a gene works. All of these questions that we can ask are dependent on the part of cognition that you're looking at and what parts of the brain and what mechanisms in the brain are associated with that in much more fundamental ways than we've recently recognized. Like I said earlier, sleep deprivation affects you across the board, but it doesn't affect you across the board in the same way exactly all the time. It's a lot more complicated than that.
So Hans, you commented on the fact that there are a collection of sensitivities we need to be aware of about the impacts of sleep restriction and sleep deprivation, especially in environments which are time critical, where there's uncertainty, things are dynamic. You spoke to this issue about the loss of a capacity to bind context in the environment and respond appropriately to that. Many of the communities of people who are responsible for responding in those most critical environments operate often under the assumption that they will only see negative consequences of these things when it's the case that their sleep restriction or sleep deprivation somehow becomes extreme. However, we know that these effects are prevalent, for instance, within the military. Here at IHMC, we work a lot with the Department of Defense, and according to studies by the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, about 62% of soldiers are chronically sleep deprived. Can you talk a little bit about the fact that even modest amounts of sleep loss can actually have a negative effect on cognitive and physical performance?
Yeah, so the question you asked earlier about my relocation to Washington State University and Greg Belenke's call that I got while I was working with David Dinges at the University of Pennsylvania is actually very central to the answer to that question, because the experiments that David Dinges and Greg Belenke had been working on that I had the privilege of also being involved in were about this very question. If you just get a little bit less sleep every day, does that actually then have any consequences or not? And there were very prominent sleep researchers in the field at the time that basically said that if you sleep at least 4 hours a day and you get a good cup of coffee, you're going to be okay. And they had actually good reasons to believe that. But David Dinges and Greg Belenke questioned this quote-unquote wisdom and said, well, maybe the reason we think that is because we haven't been able to sufficiently sensitively measure the effects of sleep loss carefully. And if you actually looked at it more closely, maybe you would see that even a slight amount of sleep loss actually has consequences. And then over time, if you do this every day, maybe there are cumulative consequences to that. And so they did experiments that were well designed to be dose response experiment. So there were different amounts of sleep that people would get on a day-to-day basis for a number of days in a row. So there was a control group that got 8 hours of sleep every day for 14 days in the lab, very carefully measured. There was a group with mild sleep restriction getting 6 hours of sleep per day, so 2 hours less than the control group every day. And then there was another group that was more severely sleep restricted at 4 hours time to sleep per day for 14 days straight. And lo and behold, the groups that had insufficient sleep, that had less than 8 hours, showed impairment over, of course, we knew that was going to come. But what was interesting is that the impairment built up a little bit every day, and it continued to build up over those 14 days. And after 14 days with 4 hours time in bed, so sleeping about half of what the control group was doing, after 14 days on that schedule, the impairments grew to a level that were so bad that they were equivalent to not sleeping at all for 2 days straight, right? So skipping 2 nights, so that's 2 all-nighters in a row. And I don't know if anybody's ever tried that, and I would not recommend them doing that at home, but that is a significant amount of impairment. And so you reach the exact same level of impairment by curtailing your sleep little by little every day. Over time, you will build up to a level of impairment that's equivalent to that. And so the consequences of chronic sleep restriction, or sustained sleep loss, if you will, are actually quite profound. But they come in small increments, and so they go a little bit unnoticed from day to day, but they do add up.
Yeah, it becomes a normalcy thing.
Yeah.
In other words, the person, this is normal. They don't realize they're normally defective.
Yeah, and to anticipate a question that I think you might want to ask is, what do people actually think happens to them? And if you ask them subjectively...
I was just going to ask you that.
I knew you were going to.
He's so clever.
That question always comes right next to it. Do people recognize that this is happening to them? And the answer is no, not really. They do recognize that they're sleep restricted, that they're not optimal. And so the first couple of days on a schedule like that, they'll be like, yeah, I'm a little bit more sleepy than I normally would be. But then their responses to, in terms of sleepiness, level out. They become stable, and they're saying, like, after 14 days, they're still saying, I'm a little bit more sleepy than I normally would be. But if you look at their performance impairment, their actual objective impairment, it's massively degraded. It's really bad. And they're still saying, I think I'm just a little bit less optimal, a little bit more sleepy than I normally would be. So you get this increasing discrepancy between what you're thinking and what's actually happening to you. And I think therein lies that's one of the reasons why chronic sleep restriction is so dangerous in reality. People do lose awareness of how impaired they actually are.
So you spoke to these dose-response effects and the accumulated damage that comes from insufficient sleep. As a follow-up, is there any evidence, Hans, that people in general are able to grow accustomed to operating under those conditions? So the study that you were just describing was a 14-day study, right, which is an extremely long study and for people to be in a carefully controlled laboratory environment. There is a general assumption out in the public that if you are somebody who is in a situation for an extended period of time where you're only able to get 6 hours of sleep a night, 5 hours of sleep a night, you will somehow accommodate that biologically, neurologically. You'll learn to function effectively in that environment. What is your opinion on that?
Well, so I honestly believe that people actually think that, because that, as we talked about, the subjective awareness becomes increasingly dissociated from what's actually going on. So I think that people honestly believe that they are getting used to it. I don't think they're trying to fool themselves. I think their brains maybe try to fool themselves, but I don't think they're dishonest about this. I think they really think that. But we know at the same time that their objective performance actually degrades and keeps getting worse. And I'm sure that there will be a level of convergence where at some point it doesn't get any worse anymore because it's as bad as it can be, right? And until they maybe then subsequently actually get themselves into an accident or something like that. But there's also this issue of the instability we talked about previously, where these gaps in your performance, this local sleep phenomenon, if you will, are really the way the sleep deprivation effects express themselves, at least to some extent. And so now what happens is, if you're chronically sleep restricted and you're, say, answering your email or something like that, right? So you'll have these instabilities in your brain, you'll have these little gaps, but you've got your spelling checker on and you've got, you proofread your emails. Most of the time, you can actually operate relatively well under these circumstances. Maybe a little bit slower, you may be a little bit less accurate, but nothing bad will really happen to you. And so we get this false impression that you can actually work just fine under these circumstances and that you will, in fact, be able to cope with these circumstances and you'll get away with it. And then add to that, you take a cup of coffee, you take a walk, you get some sunshine, get some bright light exposure to feel more alert. And all of a sudden, things look to be just fine. And why should you sleep more? But it's the instability in the brain and these rare circumstances where you do end up on that intersection while you're driving, while somebody else is also on that intersection and you miss the traffic light, where all of a sudden it becomes apparent that this wasn't such a great idea, right? But those are rare circumstances. So for many of us, it looks like we will in fact be able to get away with less sleep and we're going to be fine. And the tragedy of this is that most of the time they're right, just not always.
Central to the results that you've been describing is an assessment called the Psychomotor Vigilance Test, or PVT for short. The PVT, at least as implemented in some protocols, is a 10-minute, one-choice reaction time task that requires responding as quickly as possible to a stimulus that appears at some random interval. Can you discuss why this test is so central to understanding vigilant attention?
So the task has been optimized to capture this instability, this local sleep phenomenon, these gaps that Arthur Bills in the 1930s already talked about, to sample these very frequently. So you have to remember that if the brain goes offline while you're sleep deprived from time to time, and you have a task that only asks you to respond every so often, there's a good chance that you'll never actually see this instability, right? You have to sample the brain frequently. You have to actually probe the brain frequently to see this phenomenon to begin with. And so the psychomotor vigilance task, or the PVT, is optimized to sample the brain very frequently and to force you to be engaged with this task for just a 10-minute period. But in that 10-minute period, you do about 90 or so responses to a stimulus that comes up at unexpected moments, which means you have to maintain focus for those full 10 minutes all the time. And under those circumstances, that is almost the best possible scenario in which you can expose these instabilities in the brain. So it's been very sensitive to this instability and has made us recognize that the effects of sleep deprivation aren't just a gradual loss of function, but actually an instability that happens moment to moment and varies moment to moment. There's an interesting question that I always ask my graduate students, and they never really fully appreciate why I think this is an important question. The 10-minute PVT, it's a simple reaction time task. That's how you would actually describe it. And it's not simple per se in the sense that it's easy to do, but it's very difficult to come up with a task that is more simple in terms of what you need to do than a 10-minute reaction time task. Yet, for some reason, it's extremely difficult for the brain to do. Even when you're well rested, it requires full attention. It's tough to do. How is it that the fantastic brains that humans have evolved can't just for 10 minutes just stay focused on one task? I find this a very fascinating question because I think if we understood that question better, or the answer to that question better, we would have a lot more insight into what are the limits of capability of the human brain. This is apparently very difficult, whereas solving a integration for a math student is easy. How is that?
It's a testament to how foundational the impacts of sleep loss are on our functioning.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
Hans, in 2019, you published a review paper with Amanda Hudson and Kimberly Hahn in Neuropsychopharmacology. In that paper, you point out that research on sleep deprivation, vigilant attention, and brain function may help determine the fixed as well as the malleable connections between specific neuronal pathways involved in specific cognitive processes. Will you please expand on this point?
I think that point does need expansion because that sentence, I think, needs to be working. It's so vague. So we touched upon this a little bit earlier to some extent. As we went through our conversation, we recognized that there is an importance to differentiating the different parts of cognition, right? So vigilant attention is not the same as binding of information in memory, is not the same as emotion regulation or anything of those things. They're all different in very fundamental ways. And treating them all as the same thing is probably a problem. We also have individual differences in how well people deal with sleep deprivation or how impacted they are by sleep deprivation, so how vulnerable they are to sleep loss. And these individual differences themselves are also dependent on which part of cognition you're talking about. So you can have a person who is vulnerable to sleep loss in the visual and attention domain, but they can be actually quite resilient if it comes to like cognitive flexibility or some other ability that they might have. And so that now means that although the underlying phenomenon of sleep deprivation affects the brain as a whole, the way it affects the brain depends on which task we're talking about, which person we're talking about. And that probably means that the underlying substrates, the underlying pathways in the brain can be differentiated, right? Now, that question about what are different pathways that are underlie different aspects of cognition is not unique to sleep deprivation research. The entire field of psychology would like to know the answer to that as well, and neurology, and so on and so on. So the cool thing about sleep deprivation, if I can say it that way, is that it's a reversible experiment where we can sleep deprive you and then we give you a night of, or maybe 2 nights of recovery sleep, and you're going to be totally fine. And if we do this in a protected environment of a laboratory where you cannot be run over by a bus by accident because we don't have any there, then we can repeat this experiment and we can query the brain and ask these questions about how do these pathways in the brain actually work over and over and over again, because we can just do this experiment safely and effectively, completely reverse it, and put the brain in this compromised state that will expose the different components that it has, the different pathways that are involved, and tease apart the different elements of cognition and how they relate to the neuronal structures that we have impacted. And I think most people that do sleep deprivation research, especially those that do like brain imaging and so on, they all realize that. But I don't think we've fully unlocked the potential of this idea yet, because we haven't really spent enough time in carefully differentiating these different components of cognition. And as we start to tease apart these different components of cognition and we put that lens on the whole thing, then we have a much more powerful paradigm in teasing apart how different parts of the brain actually work, what they do for us when we do different tasks, and how they get compromised when we're sleep deprived.
So ultimately, you're advocating for an even more comprehensive and systematic matching of the behavioral requirements and the assessment approaches in these carefully controlled laboratory studies matched against the neurofunctional architecture of the brain.
Yes, and I know that that's an interest of yours as well, Kevin. So,
well, it is, yes.
Yeah.
You've called me out.
In the spirit of better understanding the neurocognitive effects of sleep deprivation, you undertook an interesting study that I suspect everyone can relate to. One of the more common patterns we see in the workplace is how people cut back on their sleep a little bit during the work week, and then they try to catch up on weekends. Your study revealed some interesting insights that offered theoretical and practical implications for sleep science. So, could you tell us about the design of this study and what the implications are for that person I described?
So the design of the study was going back to this study we talked about earlier, where you have people being chronically sleep restricted to 4 hours of time in bed per day for 14 days. So we did a variation on this experiment, made it a little bit shorter. It's now an 11-day experiment, plus a couple of days of baseline and recovery at the end. But so 11 days of actual experimentation. And the first 5 days are 4 hours time in bed for sleep. So 4 hours sleep opportunity every day. And the last 5 days of this 11-day time span are also that same schedule. But in the middle, right in the middle, on the 6th day, we change something. We give you more or less sleep than the other days. So one scenario was where one group was exposed to 5 days of 4 hours time in bed. Then on the 6th day, they got 12 hours for basically an essentially full recovery, as much sleep as you can get. And then back to 5 days on 4 hours time in bed. Another group had 5 days of 4 hours time in bed, and then instead of 12 hours, they would either have like 10 or 8 hours or 6 hours of sleep, but more than the 4 hours. And then they went back to 4 hours time in bed for 5 days. There were also groups that had 5 days of 4 hours time in bed per day. And then on the 6th day, we gave them even less, 2 hours or no sleep whatsoever. And then subsequently went back to a 4 hours time in bed for 5 days. And so the question we had was, what is the acute and long-term consequences of this day in the middle where we changed the schedule, right? So the 12 hours time in bed is more like somebody who's got a short weekend, just one day for a weekend, and recuperates and then goes back to a normal work schedule where they get insufficient sleep. And the idea would be that if this was very helpful, that the 12 hours time in bed would give you a full recuperation, and then the next 5 days would look just like the first 5 days because you had fully recovered. And then after that, you just had another work week, which was essentially basically the same as the first week that you had. That's not what we found. On the other extreme, we had this case where there were 5 days of 4 hours time in bed, and now we give you a day with no sleep whatsoever. So now we acutely sleep deprive you. And we already know that the acute sleep deprivation is not going to help, right? It's going to make things worse. And so the expectation we had a priori there was that with the total sleep deprivation now on top of the 5 days of sleep restriction, then going back to 5 days of sleep restriction subsequently would make things not only just worse, but like really, really bad, really bad. That's not what we found either. And then there was the middle group is sort of our anchor group where we had 5 days of 4 hours time in bed. The 6th day is also 4 hours. And the next 5 days is 4 hours. And that's our active control, if you will, because we already knew the answer to that one. Because that's the shorter version of the 14-day experiment that we'd already done. And that's what we found. We did find that exact same thing. But what we found with the other groups that had either on the 6th day 12 hours or 10 hours or 8 hours or 6 hours of sleep, or less than the 4 hours, 2 hours or no sleep whatsoever, they all had an acute response to the amount of sleep that they got, so that the total sleep deprivation group did get worse on the 6th day. They did really actually show more deficits. And the 12-hour group did really get recuperation almost back to normal, but almost back to baseline. But then on day number 7, when they were back to the 5 days of 4 hours time in bed, they started to converge very rapidly to a schedule that was just like the one with the control condition of 4 hours time in bed all the time. As if that intermediate day, that 1 day of either more sleep or less sleep, basically hadn't happened. It washed out very quickly. And so what we learned from that is that you have to sort of dissociate between the acute effects of sleep, so the acute recuperation, and you can get back to normal really quickly if under those circumstances. But there is something that you're carrying with you that is a sensitivity that you build up from your past sleep history that you carry forth with you that very quickly becomes the dominant force of how you respond to sleep restriction. And so after on day 7 and then on day 8 and on day 9, by day 9, it was entirely irrelevant what had happened on day 6. It just didn't matter at all. If you had recuperated, you lost that recuperation very quickly. If you had been more sleep deprived even yet, and so therefore made much worse, the effects of that also dissipated very quickly. I think the practical implications of that is that you carry your sleep history, your long-term sleep-wake history with you for a long time. And if you want to be optimally prepared for things to come, you can't sort of just sleep in for just a weekend and hope that things will be okay, because you carry your prior sleep loss with you. You carry that vulnerability with you. And so you will at some point actually get back to that vulnerability that will expose itself. And so you won't be as recuperated as you thought you were. You will be recuperated acutely, and so you'll be good to it for a day. But then after that, you're going to go right back to the deficit you already had. There's also a very theoretical implication of that, is that apparently, if you are chronically sleep restricted, and then on top of that, you are totally sleep deprived, and then you're further chronically sleep restricted, there are no real long-term consequences to speak of that acute total sleep deprivation that I threw on top of the already chronic sleep restriction. And if you now think that sleep has a very important function to play with cleaning up the brain or whatever your popular theory for the function of sleep might be, it's going to be very difficult to explain that. If you can apparently just skip a whole night of sleep, and then a few days later, if you're already chronically sleep restricted anyway, it doesn't make much of a difference anymore. So what happened to the energy metabolism? What happened to the waste clearance? What happened to the synaptic plasticity? All those important functions that we think sleep should have. If you can just skip that whole night, and it makes no difference if you had a full recovery or a sleep deprivation, after a couple of days, you can't see the difference anymore. That has very important theoretical implications for how we understand the function of sleep. It goes further yet. You can also look at the consequences of not just performance while you're awake, but what happens to the sleep itself in this experiment. And if you do a total sleep deprivation experiment, you just have somebody in the lab for a couple of days, you completely sleep deprive them, and then you give them recovery sleep. You see this massive intensification of sleep that we call the recovery process, the recuperation. We believe that this, what we call slow wave sleep, is the most important part of sleep because it apparently, and so we believe, provides the recuperation from the prior sleep deprivation. So we think that slow wave sleep has an important function to play in cleaning up the brain or undoing the damage from the prior sleep loss. Well, if you're chronically sleep restricted, you don't get that response at all. You don't see that rebound effect. And if you do a mathematical decomposition of what we see, then we see that the waking response has this long-term history component to it, right? So there's an acute effect, but there's also the long-term history that you carry with you. So from a mathematical perspective, there are not just one function you have to track, but two functions you have to track. For sleep, that's not true at all. Sleep has just acute response. Your current state of sleep deprivation determines what happens next. Your long-term sleep-wake history doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter how you got to be sleepy. What happens next is determined only by your current state of sleepiness. So the sleep does not carry this long-term history with it, but your wakefulness does, which again poses serious challenges for what the function of sleep could be, because apparently sleep is not all that concerned with how much damage you've done in the past or how much energy you've lost or how much waste you've accumulated. As long as it will only deal with it at a short-term basis, so just for tonight, and then tomorrow is another day. And I find this endlessly fascinating because most of our theories about sleep and sleep function actually rely on some sort of damage control or energy supply or something that you would count. And if it's missing, you need to resupply or you need to deal with it. Doesn't seem like that's how the dynamics actually play out, which I find super fascinating because that try to explain that with a theoretical framework. It's not so easy.
Or it could be a useful, maybe not useful now, but once useful evolutionary adaptation to the environment and the way people lived a long time ago.
And I think that's exactly it. Sleep is not so much... One of the fascinating things about this chronic sleep restriction phenomenon is that the brain isn't doing all that great of a job in trying to actually dampen your impairments, right? If we know that you can produce a lot of slow wave sleep after total sleep deprivation, and now when you're chronically sleep restricted, after 14 days, you reach the same level of impairment, but now the brain is not doing anything that we can see to undo that. But it has the capacity. Why isn't it? Maybe that's not its primary function. Maybe, as you alluded to, sleep is really mostly concerned with making sure that we sleep at night and awake during the day, because that's when we're least vulnerable and most effective at what we do. And these cognitive consequences that we incur from chronic sleep restriction are a side effect that is problematic, but not really what sleep is all about.
Is the thought that the value or the importance, I probably should say, of slow wave sleep is related to glymphatic clearance?
Yeah, that's being disputed now because there's now evidence that glymphatic clearance, so the ability of the brain to clear waste from itself through the glymphatic system, which feeds into the lymphatic system, which is the way the brain would get rid of the waste products. A recent analysis from a group in the UK actually showed that the rate of clearance is actually lower during slow wave sleep than it is during wakefulness or during other parts of sleep, as opposed to what had been posited, that it's actually higher and that slow wave sleep would somehow be involved in clearing the brain faster. That story doesn't seem to hold up. I have my own thoughts about how to interpret those findings. I think it might be related to arousal as a whole and not necessarily to sleep state per se. But that's not my area of expertise per se. And also, it's so hotly debated right now that I should probably steer clear from that.
Yeah, it is very hot right now. For our listeners, you might want to check out our interview with Jeff Iliff. It was a very good interview, and Dawn Karnagas was the co-host, and she's also worked in glymphatic research. I think the listener would find it interesting.
And I do actually work with Jeff Iliff, and so I am very familiar with his research, and I think it's endlessly fascinating. I just think, as so many other people have probably pointed out, it's not so simple.
One would be shocked if it were simple.
Yeah.
I want to follow up very briefly on a particular point that you were making in your really complete and fascinating description of the research you were just describing, Hans. And this is associated with the statement that among those who were in the chronically sleep-deprived condition, if they then had a night without sleep, that subsequently they recovered quickly from that, and it didn't really matter. But I want to make sure that we're interpreting that in the context of the negative impacts that they were already experiencing in terms of their performance as a result of being in the chronic sleep restriction protocol.
Yes.
Right. And so I just don't want listeners to make the mistake of interpreting what you were saying as, well, everything's fine if you're chronically sleep deprived and you just spend a night awake and completely deprive yourself of sleep. Now it doesn't matter. It only didn't matter from the perspective that they were able to recover back to their previously terrible level of performance.
Yeah, that's a great point that you're making here, and I totally, and thank you for bringing it up. Of course, we did this experiment to expose a dynamic, how things work, right? So I want to be very clear: chronically sleep restricting yourself to 4 hours time in bed per day is a bad idea. But in the lab, we can do it safely, and we can use it to very quickly get the brain to be compromised in a situation where we can actually study the consequences of sleep loss very quickly. So there is a collateral to this dynamic, to this long-term history that you carry with you, that you can actually use to your advantage. So again, chronic sleep restriction is a bad idea. If you're already in this bad state of impairment, then further impairment doesn't make things any worse, particularly for a long time, because it's already pretty bad, right? So you don't want to be there. But if you are there and you must, then, well, I guess it's not going to make much of a difference. But now turn this around. The same long-term dynamic also tells us that if you're not chronically sleep restricted, but you're actually chronically sleep satiated, so you're now well rested, and you're well rested for real, like day after day after day, you're well rested. This was an experiment that Walter Reed Army of Institute of Research actually conducted a number of years ago that took this idea to the next level. And they had people in a chronic sleep restriction experiment, but before they came to the lab, they were actually sleep satiated. They were actually sleeping more and more and more for a number of days, for 1 or 2 weeks before they came to the lab. And now they carried this long-term sleep-wake history, which was a very well-rested state, with them into the experiment. And lo and behold, when they were then subsequently chronically sleep restricted, they did better because that long-term well-restedness was with them, and it gave them a resilience that had a long-term effect. So we did the chronic sleep restriction experiment to expose how nature works in a safe environment of the lab, because that's how you can very quickly get to an answer about how nature works. We didn't do that because we think it was a great idea to do in the real world. But the consequence of that is that you can now take this understanding of this dynamic and apply it to your advantage by being very well rested. If you've got a very important exam coming up or a job interview or what have you, and you can afford to spend lots of time in bed for many different many days in a row, you can build up your resilience, get that long-term sleep-wake history to work to your advantage, so that when you actually get to the point where you have to do something important and now you're going to be sleep deprived, it will carry you through.
So just one night's sleep beforehand may not be enough. You want to plan a little further out in advance.
You do want to plan further out in advance, and I know how difficult that can be.
They do this, for example, with Formula One drivers who are very closely monitored in every aspect of physiology and sleep and health. That's one of the things, is that they feel that it has to be chronic, good sleep.
Yeah. And I think that's across the board in athletics, for instance, where if your performance at the game, at the match, at whatever it is that you're doing is all that critical, and all you do is train to get to that point to be as the best you possibly can, sleep needs to be part of that equation.
Now, we're using some terminology here repeatedly that I want to follow up on from a practical standpoint, right? And we had a little bit of discussion about this previously, but we've used terms like sleep need and sleep loss. And my question on behalf of people out in the general public, right, who are interested in this topic, how can we assess whether our standard sleep patterns are really adequate for us as individuals? You mentioned previously that there are significant individual differences across people in terms of how much sleep they need. Is there a valid way for us to determine what our individual sleep need is?
Well, the simple answer to that is send them to my lab and we'll figure it out.
You're going to be very busy.
I know. And I have to be honest, this is expensive research, so you don't necessarily want to do that. But actually, you're asking a very difficult question. So we've already established that with chronic sleep restriction, you lose your subjective awareness of how compromised you are, right? So you yourself, as a gauge of how well you are doing, is under these chronic sleep restriction conditions is a difficult thing to do. You're not going to get it right. There are also individual differences, as you mentioned. And we know that there are people who are resilient to sleep loss, they're vulnerable to sleep loss, that depends on the task they're doing. And if you ask these same people that are resilient to sleep loss or those that are vulnerable to sleep loss how they feel about their own performance, they answer the same thing. So the vulnerable and the resilient people don't really differentiate from each other because they map their experiences onto themselves. They have no way of knowing how somebody else is doing or how they feel. And so you get the same answer. So you can't ask somebody, like what we oftentimes like to do in operational settings, are you good to go? Are you okay? Are you well rested? The answer you get is probably an honest answer, but it isn't an accurate answer because it doesn't account for chronic sleep restriction state. And it doesn't really account for individual differences either, because the brain is not capable of getting that answer right. So asking people to identify that for themselves is problematic. But what we can do is we can ask people around us, how are we functioning? Are we doing okay? And so one of the ways we try to do this in operational settings is make team assessments a part of the approach. Of course, if you take like a hospital environment, we do this all the time, right? So you go to a surgery and you have a team of doctors and nurses surrounding you, and they all check on each other to see if the procedures are being carried out the right way. And if they don't, then they catch each other's errors because it's very difficult to do it yourself. Somebody else can do that much better. It's the exact same thing with sleep deprivation and the effects of that sleep deprivation has on your cognition. ask other people to see how you're performing under certain circumstances, give you an honest assessment if you can, and tell you if it looks like you're not functioning well enough to be safely in an environment where you're doing something important. Go take a break, go withdraw from this environment because you might be a risk for yourself or for others. And if you can, get some sleep.
Of course, there are very strong social barriers to that actually happening. If you were assessed to need more sleep, very often this would be negative and not career enhancing, and others know that. And then, of course, in an operating room, that's how it's supposed to work, the way he described it. But if a nurse does that with a surgeon, this will not be well appreciated by the surgeon.
Yeah, so there's a concept that we call just culture, right? So it's the culture where you are allowed to say these sorts of things. And in fatigue risk management, which is now a maturing field, which sort of a spin-off of sleep research deals with how do you deal with fatigue in operational settings. Just culture is a very important topic because you do have to be able to call people out in a respectful way, but call people out when they're just not fit for duty at this particular point in time because they didn't have enough sleep. And mature fatigue risk management settings like commercial aviation, for instance, this is built into the equation. And so a pilot who's not ready to fly a plane is supposed to call in fatigue, as they say, and there's going to be reserves ready to take over from them. Now, if they are sleep restricted with no good reason whatsoever, they're just never really well rested when they show up for work, that's their responsibility, right? It's their responsibility to report fit for duty. But if circumstances overtake them and now they're not well rested anymore because of something that's not under their control, then the flip side of that is that you are now going to be covered. You're going to be okay.
Well, Hans, what about your sleep schedule? Do you get 7 or 8 hours sleep every night, particularly during the work week? Do you try to catch up on weekends? What's your schedule like?
So I, just like everybody else, I'm bound to reality and the requirements of the job. And so everybody who's worked in academia knows that there are times when you just have to get a grant proposal in or finish a paper or prepare for a talk like I'm going to be doing tomorrow and just pull a little bit of extra time in from the night to get that done. I am not exempt from any of those stresses or from those realities, but I value my sleep. I like sleeping. I do sleep in whenever I can. I think the best way to spend my time when I'm not actually writing an important paper is to be on a beach and get a nap. I think that's just awesome. And so I do value my sleep. And I do recognize that when I'm not getting sleep on a regular basis, that I am compromised, not only because of my work, but also I see it in how well I do when I give a talk or do something else that's important. So I like to prioritize sleep whenever I can. But I also, with the work that I've done in the lab with these long-term history findings and all that kind of stuff, but also the work I do in operational settings where people really, night workers just can't have the sleep that they need sometimes because, well, they have to go to work. I also recognize that you have to take a little bit more of a broader perspective on that the perfect becomes the enemy of the good, right? So you can try to get your regular 8 hours of sleep every day and so on, but then you really can't get anything done sometimes that is important in your life otherwise, and you have to compromise. And I think the compromise is the critical part. The way the physiology, the way the biology works is it has this built-in homeostatic process we talked about earlier and the circadian process that try to drive us into a particular state of nighttime sleep and daytime wakefulness. And they work to our advantage. They will restore balance for us if we give it an opportunity. And so I think that an occasional excursion from the perfect schedule is not all that problematic as long as you don't make it a systematic excursion. If you don't sleep enough on a day-to-day basis, like in this experiment that we did in the lab, you're going to have serious problems. But if you have an occasional day when you're just not getting enough sleep, like that just happens. I mean, your neighbors are making noise and you wake up in the middle of the night. Not your fault. It's not the end of the world. And I think in sleep science and sleep medicine, we have come to this realization that getting 8 hours of sleep on a regular basis is really important for your cognition, for your health. And we have sort of made it a policy statement that people should sleep 7 or more hours or more a day or else. And I think in that point, you're drawing the line a little too sharply. It's the or else is not, people experience on a day-to-day basis that the or else is maybe not all that bad from time to time, as long as they don't make it systematic. And so if you set a hard rule of this, bad things will happen if you don't sleep 7 hours a day every day, I think you're actually undermining your ability to manage sleep in a more sensible way, where real people with real constraints on their time have to deal with an occasional night that they can't get the sleep that they need. And that might be just fine. That might not be perfect. That might not be ideal, but it's going to be okay. But try to then not make this a habit, because then it's not going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. I know a couple people who are so interested in sleep and how they sleep, and they measure it through multiple systems that they can't sleep because they're fretting about sleeping.
Yeah.
They literally, like, first thing, how did I sleep?
Yeah.
And they think about it and fret about it.
Yeah, and this happens now where people come to me when they say, like, I've read in the newspaper, I've read in the magazines, I've been told on the radio that I need to get this certain amount of sleep, and I don't sleep that. So am I going to be okay? And I asked them, well, how are you doing? And it's like, no, I'm totally fine, but just really worried about, I've been told that I'm not sleeping right. And I think once you get to that point, you've gone too far. If there is, it's okay to worry about your sleep. It's okay to see a doctor, absolutely okay to see a doctor if you've got serious sleep problems, and you should seek medical advice. But if you're not experiencing any problems, if anybody else is not telling you there's any problems, and you just worry about your sleep because somebody else told you should worry about it, that is a little bit problematic to me.
Yeah, I agree. Hans, you were recently featured in a news article about the dreaded midday slump. This is something that many folks experience at work, for example. Despite the common belief that the slump happens as a result of eating lunch and the consequences of that, you argue that the slump comes down to a gap between your two body clocks when you don't get enough sleep. Will you elaborate on how it is that inadequate sleep results in this gap?
Yeah, so we don't really see the post-lunch dip or postprandial dip, as people might call it, when we study people in the lab under fully well-rested conditions, like in the control conditions we have in experiments. It kind of disappears. We don't really see it. What I think is going on there is the interaction between that circadian clock that keeps us awake during the day and asleep at night, and then this homeostatic process that is supposed to deal with the discrepancies we might have. These two processes, these biological processes, actually are coordinated in time in such a way that is the longer you're awake during the day, the more you build up a pressure for sleep, which is from the homeostatic process, that at the end of the day basically tells you it's time to go to sleep now. But then the circadian system wants to make sure that you don't fall asleep while you're still light out and you could do useful things with your day. So it builds up a pressure for wakefulness at the same time that peaks towards the late afternoon, early evening hours to offset that homeostatic pressure for sleep. And these two processes are beautifully coordinated so that if you subtract the two, if you subtract the effect of the pressure for wakefulness from the pressure for sleep, you get a beautiful, more or less flat level of alertness across the day. And then at night, then the opposite happens and you get a beautiful, stable level of sleepiness so that you're going to get consolidated sleep at night. This works differently in animals, but in humans who typically have one or maybe two sleep periods, but one predominant nighttime sleep period, that really consolidates the day and the night beautifully for us. But now if you're somewhat sleep restricted, like many of us are, that homeostatic pressure actually is a little bit elevated. Not building up over time, but it just has a slight elevation. And now the pressure for sleep, therefore, is not completely counted by the pressure for wakefulness from the circadian system anymore. And the way this plays out, if you do the mathematics for it, is that you get the discrepancy is the biggest just around those mid-afternoon hours when we typically have lunch. And so people have associated with phenomenon with the time that we have a break for lunch. And then if you eat lots of carbohydrates, you can actually see some small amount of sleepiness from that. But really what's happening there is that your homeostat is just slightly elevated. And during that mid-afternoon, your circadian system can't really counter it as much. And so you get this little dip. Now, some cultures take advantage of that dip by actually using a nap there and calling it a siesta to sort of use the opportunity to actually sleep then, which is a good thing to do, especially if you, for whatever reason, want to use the evening hours and the morning hours more and curtail your nighttime sleep, which happens in cultures that live in warm places where it's just too hot during the day. So they move their activity to the early morning hours and late evening hours. So we're talking about Mediterranean countries and so on. And so they make use of it. But if you don't have that chronic sleep restriction, you don't really see that dip. Now, because of the realities of the world we live in, pretty much all of us are slightly chronically sleep restricted. So many of us experience it. And so there's two things you can do about it is actually there's more things you can do about it, but take the siesta nap and just sleep through it and make use of the opportunity to actually get some sleep in, which would be useful. And I would encourage people to do that. But if that's not a possibility, you could also, as many people will do, take a cup of coffee and just get through it that way and use the coffee to enhance your alertness for a little bit. Or take the opportunity to take a break and get outside, and especially in places like this here in Pensacola, get some sunshine, get some bright light, which gives you an alertness boost. Take the opportunity to go out to the beach or whatever, get some hiking in, make use of it to get your exercise in for the day. I like to sort of be efficient in that way, deal with that at the same time, and you'll get through it. It's typically much, much less severe than the effects we get from total sleep deprivation. So the mid-afternoon dip is noticeable, and if you let it will let you fall asleep if you give it the opportunity. But if you're not chronically sleep restricted, you're not going to experience it much at all.
90% recent research has suggested of North Americans are metabolically dysregulated and react very badly to what they eat at lunch if it's carbohydrate heavy. And you can see it in their blood if you draw blood. Do you think that plays a role or has no role?
Now, we know that carbohydrate-rich food will make you sleepy, even in people that are otherwise perfectly healthy. The effects are not super strong. You can measure them in a lab. If you measure it very carefully, you can see it. I think in the practical world, that is a smallish effect. They sort of get washed out by everything else that's going on. But I also have to say that much of that research has been done in people that are healthy and lean. And we know that there are people that are metabolically compromised.
No, the majority of people are.
Yeah, obese. And the story probably plays out differently. And we don't actually know the answer to your question in that sense.
Yeah, I just came across last year that study. I think it was from University of North Carolina that they had the shocking statistic in this study. I think it was 92% they claimed of Americans had significant metabolic issues. And that's, if that's even close to right, that's a very worrisome number.
Yeah, although as a side note, of course, with the population changing the way it is, what's normal, it becomes a sliding scale, right?
But normal isn't the goal. I fired a physician for calling me normal once. Homer Simpson's normal. You never want to be normal. None of you guys are normal.
Right.
Normal's the worst thing somebody can tell you.
Yeah.
And when Quest tells you it's normal.
Let's aspire to be better than normal.
That's right. Normal's not good. Well, Hans, you have had a very successful career, and you've been great fun to talk with. As you look back at your career and your life, what have you learned about science and life that really matters?
It's a very difficult question because the having a career in science it gets you exposed to so many different things. So there's so many highlights that it's tough to really lift one thing out. But one of the things that I really enjoy and I think is particularly teaches me a lot as well is working with graduate students trying to learn how to do science. And I tell them one of the things that I find fascinating about science, about doing science, is that we're trying to figure out how nature works. In trying to figure out how nature works, we have a partner, being nature, that is indifferent. Nature does not fundamentally care whether or not we ever figure out how it works. Has no obligation to us to give us the answers. And if you don't bother to query it in the right way, it will never tell you anything. But at the flip side of that is that if you ask the right questions, if you put your mind to it, if you're using your smarts to ask innovative questions of nature in ways that will ultimately unlock its secrets. That's the challenge. It's on us to try to figure out from an indifferent partner to give us the answers that we're seeking, right? And so when I start saying that nature is an indifferent partner, the people are like, well, that's such a negative way of looking at it. But I think it's an opportunity because you can ask the same question or different questions or same question in different ways of nature over and over and over again. It will reliably give you the same answers if you ask the same questions, if you do it right. And if you ask a different question, it will give you a different answer. And you can keep doing this. And so you can use your intellect to come up with clever ways to force nature that doesn't really want to cooperate per se, to still tell you what you need to know. And that is the challenge, I think, of what I find so fascinating about being a scientist, is how do we do that? How do we ask the right questions so that nature will unlock its secrets? And I'm fascinated by when I see people come up with innovative ways that all of a sudden they realize that their brain is capable of asking a novel question of nature that reveals something we didn't know before, simply because they were smart enough to ask the right question the right way. And then, of course, what's the other part of that is the flip side of that is that you only really learn something when you're wrong. So you can't, statistically speaking, from a statistical perspective, you can't ever really actually prove yourself right. You can only prove yourself wrong. But there's a more philosophical flip side to that, is that if you did an experiment and everything came out exactly the way you expected, you have learned nothing. You only learn something when something happens that you didn't see coming, because then apparently nature is trying to tell you something new. And so inherent to the challenge of doing science is that failure must be embraced because it's part of the job. And the failure is where you actually make progress. That doesn't come naturally to us. We always want to be right about everything, but you're not going to learn anything if you're always right. You got to be wrong. So I tell my students, dare to be wrong with conviction, and then put everything you can into proving yourself wrong. And if that's how you do science, then first of all, being wrong becomes part of the equation. And so it's not something to be shameful about. If you had a reasonable expectation to expect that something should happen and it doesn't, doesn't mean that you were stupid. It means you've learned something new. Right. And so that's inherent to the trade of science. And I think working with new students to sort of embrace this perspective, I think is fascinating because it doesn't come naturally to us, but that's how you make progress.
Yep. As long as the question they posed to nature was a good question,
yes,
then failure is a teaching experience.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I know people that reliably ask the wrong question and still fail.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about that.
Well, let's just say it's not a teaching experience.
It's a crying experience.
You've certainly been asking a lot of the right questions of nature and unlocking a lot of secrets, Hans, and your efforts at doing that have you on the road a lot. You do a lot of traveling professionally, but I understand that you also do a lot of personal travel. You and your wife both love to travel. A little birdie told me that your wife has a major complaint about your travels. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, there's two parts to that actually, really. So there's the fact that because I'm on the road a lot, and I let me step back a little bit. I'm on the road a lot in part because I go to conferences, but also I think the research that I've been able to do and the questions I've been able to ask were driven in large part by the fact that I have fantastic collaborators that I can seek out and bounce off ideas off and work together with. And so I visit them from time to time to get exposed to new ideas and to move the science forward. And it wouldn't be without those collaborations and all that travel to be able to do all this progress that we've actually made. And it's actually an opportunity also to go visit wonderful places like where I'm right now and see new parts of the world. I think the chief complaint that my wife has, other than the fact that I'm away too much, is that even when she can join me, is we only really go to places where other scientists have set up shop and organized conferences and so on. And those are beautiful places. But there's this whole entire other part of the world where people don't organize conferences or don't have institutions or don't happen to be placed, that we don't get to see this way because we always end up in the places where the other scientists are. And so my mission that I've been told that I need to undertake is to actually see the rest of the world too, and not be limited only to where scientists are, which I see her point.
Absolutely. But I'm the same way. So but I do see her point. And we're talking about long distance travel, and this involves cutting through many, many time zones and causes substantial circadian disruption, sometimes called jet lag. So do you do anything in particular to manage your sleep or manage the whole long distance travel experience?
I do, but it's rather ad hoc in the sense that, let me give you an example. So I just a few days ago, I was in Sevilla, Spain, across the Atlantic. Then I flew to Spokane, which is on the other side of the US. So that's a 9-hour time difference, and spent about 3 days in Spokane. And now I'm here in Pensacola, which is in the central time zone, if I'm not mistaken. So that's 2 hours back the other direction. And so I deliberately kept my sleep-wake schedule at home on you guys' time because I knew I was going to be having to transfer to here anyway. And I wasn't going to be able to adapt to my normal home time fast enough anyway. So I used this opportunity to actually be alert during this interview, which otherwise at this time of day, I necessarily wouldn't maybe be so alert. But that's an ad hoc solution. It turns out when you travel, because of other constraints, that managing sleep and circadian rhythms the way you would do in the lab is very difficult in practice. There's times when planes go, there's times when stores are open, when hotels are available, when transportation is available, all those sorts of things get in the way of actually very carefully managing the way we would prescriptively say would be best if we knew what to do exactly, right? And we kind of do, but in practice it becomes difficult. But there is this very fortunate homeostatic process that deals with whatever the circadian system can't deal with properly, that works to our advantage. So it just so happens that I know a little bit about that system, but it works for everybody. You don't have to know how it works. It works for you anyway. And so if you realize, for instance, that if you go from here to Japan or whatever, something that's more than 6 time zones away, if it really took about an hour a day of shifting to really adapt, like what the rule of thumb is that we use in our field, It would take more than a week to adapt for a trip to Japan, and nobody would ever go to Japan from here because it wouldn't be worth it. But that's not actually what we experience. We experience 1 or 2, maybe 3 days of jet lag, and then you're actually pretty much okay. And again, that's your homeostatic system working into your advantage. It's filling in for what the circadian system can't adapt to that quickly. So having realized that, I've realized that what I need to do, what is best for me, is when I'm on a plane, I have this enclosed environment where there's no calls, there's no email, there's no nothing. I can get a ton of work done. And I did that, in fact, also on the trip to Pensacola yesterday. Worked on a paper, used that time optimally to get my work done. And then when I get there to the place where I need to be, then I manage my sleep retroactively with the homeostat to my advantage to get back to the schedule that is appropriate for that particular location pretty fast. Now, I say deliberately that that's what I do because it works really well for me. I work with a lot of operational areas where pilots and other people actually have to manage their sleep to get people safely across the Atlantic or whatever it is that they do. And I wouldn't necessarily give them the same advice that I apply to myself because the circumstances and the requirements and the things that they need to do are not the things that I need to do, right? So the answer to what do, I would preempt with to say, well, this works for me because of my particular circumstances and what I try to accomplish. I wouldn't necessarily say that everybody should do that now because that would be a good idea. I wouldn't.
Well, that's a good answer. For our listeners, I would recommend them checking out a smartphone app called Time Shifter out of Harvard. I don't know if you've seen that app. It helps manage the unmanageable. In other words, it doesn't fix things that are unmanageable, but it makes you aware of them where you can know what to do, but you can't actually do it, right? Like it'll give you sort of look at sunlight now or drink coffee now, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, the other thing about it, of course, is that, as an aside, so the advice to go out and get some sunshine and so on is very helpful. And I know that the timing of light matters, but really from a practical perspective, if you are in a different time zone and you want to be more alert, just go outside anyway is always good advice. Just do that. And then you can try to sort of scheme the timing of it. But from a practical perspective, it's very difficult. And from a more like, what am I actually here for in the first place? Is I want to see places. I want to go meet people. I want to be out and about. So yes, I understand the science, but I know that jet lag is going to I'm going to be overcome in 1 or 2 days anyway. And as long as I'm active, very active, I'm not going to fall asleep right on the street just like that most of the time. I'm going to be relatively okay. So I've learned that, yes, from a scientific perspective, very interesting. From a practical perspective,
it's helped me a lot on flights to Europe because you're landing there in the morning.
Yeah.
And so you naturally want to be out and active,
yeah,
right? And walking around. At least it was useful for me going to Europe is I go a lot. And so I know what my general feeling is.
Yeah. Yeah. What I do when I go to Europe is after landing, you're right, you land in the morning, which is an interesting phenomenon because the way the flights are organized is to manage air traffic, not because of that's good for your biological clock. Yeah. But so you land in the morning and then we take a short nap about 2 hours right before dinner. And then we show up for dinner again, and that works really well. But what does not work well, which my family used to do when we just moved to the United States, and this was still novel, and we would come back and we got this wonderful welcome where the lights were dim and there was a beautiful, cozy environment was created, and it was killing me. It's like, no, well intended, but all wrong.
Yeah, I could see that.
Hans, this has been a fascinating conversation on the topic of sleep, which is relevant to all of our lives. I really appreciate that you were able to travel to Pensacola and visit us here at IHMC. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for having me. I agree, this was a lot of fun. There is so much to talk about. We should do this again at some point.
Well, perhaps we will. And thanks, Hans. You were wonderful. Thank you.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Well, Ken, that was fun. Thanks for inviting me to co-host our interview with Hans today. He and his colleagues at the Sleep and Performance Research Center at Washington State University are really expanding our knowledge and understanding of how sleep deprivation and irregular sleep schedules have negative effects on people's fundamental cognitive performance and decision-making. They do some of the most rigorous and disciplined research on these topics anywhere in the world. It is really clear why we here at IHMC, as well as many people at various government departments and agencies, are so interested in Hans's work.
And it's not just the government that's paying close attention to his research, but also industries with round-the-clock workforces, such as hospitals, for example. I appreciate how Hans is not only adding to our understanding of the effects that sleep loss has on human robustness and resilience, but also investigating ways to address the challenges of sleep loss. Hans is indeed doing important work.
Agreed. This is Kevin Gluck signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.